is Michael Smith, the National Consumer Education Manager of Janome, Canada. Thank you for joining me today. And we're continuing our series of A to Z with Janome. So our Janome HQ Instagram Live is brought to you by the letter G. Can you believe we're already at the start of week 3? So it's fantastic. G is our blind hem foot. Now, one thing I love about Janomes, and that I hear from so many of you, Janome fans and users, that regardless of what machine you have, the presser feet are all the same. So the G foot is the blind hem foot for all Janome machines, regardless of which one you have. So that's a really cool thing to do. So everybody can benefit for what I'm going to talk about today. So this is my little sample. You know, I'm making this whole big sampler wall hanging that I'm going to hang outside of my office at the Janome Sewing and Learning Center, which is in Oakville, Ontario. Now, as soon as we're done COVID and we know it's safe, I'll be back in the office eventually, starting to teach classes at the Janome Sewing and Learning Center there. And in certainly one of the classes or more classes, we'll be learning all about the blind hem foot, the G foot. So the blind hem mimics, you know, hand stitching. So this way, again, you can do it very quickly and easily, professionally. On the right side of your hem, you barely see and sometimes don't even see any stitching. And then on the back side of the hem, then it's a nice even row of stitching and beautiful. So very simple and easy to do with the blind hem foot. So this is our blind hem foot. If you want to follow me down here. Now it comes with a number of the machines, but if not, then it's available in a separate blister pack. There's a 9mm version, which I have here, or as well as 7mm version. There's even a little adjustable one for 5mm machines too. So always check with your Janome dealer to make sure that you get the correct foot for your machine. So the G foot is very special in that it's got this big black guide, this little rudder, as I often call it, that is down the middle of the machine, or down the foot. And it's got this little blip. I hope you can see that. This little blip there that's also part of the black guide. So that little blip is essential because as we stitch across into our hem, by having that little blip there, it adds a little bit of slack to the needle tension. So it's not going to pull that zigzag stitch too tightly, because we don't really want to see it on the right side of our fabric. So by having that little blip there, it again allows us more even tension as that stitch forms. Now, don't confuse this G foot with the stitch in the ditch foot, as sometimes people do. The S foot is the stitch in the ditch, or the ditch quilting foot for our domestic machines. And you can see it looks very similar, but it's got a bigger rudder down the center, and it has no little blip in the middle here at all. This is just the 9mm. There's nothing there in the middle. So this is the ditch quilting foot, which is S, and this is your blind hem foot with this G that has that little rudder, but it's not as big as the stitch in the ditch foot. And mainly it's got that little blip there to form the stitches correctly as you're doing the blind hem. So we want to be sure to use the G foot for the blind hem. So what your blind hem is all about is, you can see on the right side of your fabric, I don't see any stitching at all. That's really beautiful. I can't see how my hem is done at all. And on the back side, I see a nice even row of stitches. There's some straight stitches, and then there's like a little zigzag bite into the fabric. And you may wonder then, oh, how do you do this? Well, this is actually how you stitch your blind hem, which then I'll show you in a moment. So you can see there, I've got my couple of rows of just straight stitches, and then there's this little bite into the fold of the fabric, and then it goes back, stitches, another couple of stitches, and then another little bite in the fabric, and so on. This edge here, that would be the raw edge of your hem, could be finished off with a serger, or I've just used like the pinking or the wave blade with the rotary cutter, so that'll help fraying of that edge. If it were a non-woven fabric, like a knit fabric, then you wouldn't need to worry about raveling at all. But by having that pinked edge, you can use pinking shears. Then, or if it's serged, again, then you really don't have to worry about fraying, because this row of stitching here is going to help stop any fraying as well. So it'll be a great way to have a nice flat finish for a hem, not bulky. And the best thing is on the right side, you really can't see any stitching. Now, maybe you want to show some stitching. If you use contrasting thread, then as I did here, and I purposely took a nice big bite out of that fold on the other side, so I've got this row of almost like decorative stitching. So I could do that on my hem. Now you can see here that we can adjust the bite of our rolled hem, and I'll get into the machine settings in just a minute. So I can do a nice big wide bite there, or I can do a nice more narrow bite there, and I can adjust it closer to my fold of my fabric, or I can adjust it away from my fabric. So again, we'll get into machine settings in just a minute, but very simple, easy to do. Any fabrics really. Here is this beautiful fleece. You can't see anything in this. The more textured your fabric is, the better it is to use a blind hem, because you really can't see it at all. Now we've got two different stitches or types of blind hem for many of the machines, that it's either the straight stitches, and then there's the bite, you know, and straight stitch and a bite. But here it's a small zigzag. So this is like a stretch blind hem. So this is really good. There is a little bit of stretch in this fleece, so it's good to use this stretch blind hem for any kind of knits, any kind of stretch. And again, because of the loft of this fleece, you don't see it at all. So that's really cool. This tricot knit would be used for, if I wanted like a slip or some lingerie, a little camisole. Again, there is stretch to this. So this is, again, when I want to use that stretch blind hem. Now, always do your little test samples before you start your garment. So you can see on my test sample here that I was way too much into that fold of my fabric. The bite of the zigzag stitch was too big. So then I could just adjust my fabric, and it got smaller and smaller as I went down. Now you can see here, I can see my little yellow thread a little bit, but if I was using thread that more matched my fabric, I really wouldn't see that at all. That tiny little bit of thread, that's not objectionable at all to your blind hem. Now here I don't see any stitching at all, is really the preferred result. But again, if you see just that little stitch in, if that was matching thread, you really wouldn't see it. It would be fine. Now something you can do as well, as I mentioned about taking the bite into the fold of the fabric, would be like that. And my line of stitching, that it could be way out here, closer to the raw edge of my fabric, or I can bring that whole line of stitching closer to the fold, and therefore that gives me a little bit more room here to stitch down the blind hem. You know, sometimes if we're a little too close to the raw edge of that fabric there, you know how the machines love to eat that edge of the fabric. Certainly by holding onto your thread tails, that'll help prevent that. But also if you've got a really delicate flimsy fabric, again, by moving that whole line of stitching away from that raw edge, then I can do my blind hem, and then I can come back with my scissors and trim up closer to my blind hem stitching. So that's an option as well. Now I mentioned about knits and that zigzag thread, like look at that, that hem is not going to pop at all. So that's great to be able to use that zigzag blind hem. And again, here at the back, I could trim that knit a little closer, but I really don't need to. It's going to be fine. And again, it's a knit, so it's not going to ravel, so I don't have to worry about finishing that raw edge. But again, I could either do that very quickly at the serger, or use my pinking shears, or again, I really love those pinking or wave blades on the serger to finish that off quickly. Now on this sample, this is, it's almost like a upholstery weight to me. Something thicker, a little stiffer, but it's not so stiff. I think it would make a great skirt or a fabulous tailored jacket. This worked out absolutely perfectly. I do not see stitches there at all. And when I flip to the other side, you see I used yellow thread, but I didn't see it at all on this because this fabric had enough texture, enough weight that it hid that blind hem beautifully. So again, this is how I stitch the blind hem. You see a little bit of that yellow thread there maybe. And then the straight stitches and then the little bite into the fabric, straight stitches, the little bite into the fabric, and that turned out beautifully. So always when you're going to be doing really anything, but especially a new technique, you want to experiment and do little samples. Now, regardless of your machine, if it's capable of doing a blind hem, you'll find more info in your manual. Now, if you can't find your manual, you can go online to our website, janome.ca, or if you're in your America, janome.com, and go down to the bottom of the page and it says support. And you click on that tab and that'll take you to a new page. It'll say manuals. You click on the manuals and then you can scroll through and look for your machine. There's even a retired section for machines that are no longer in production. So you can find manuals that way. And again, more information on the blind hem in your manuals. So that's good. Now, if you want to follow me to the machine, and I'm going to clip on the blind hem foot. Now, today I'm using the 15,000, Memorycraft 15,000 quilt maker. And I'm specifically going to be using the sewing applications. Now, what sewing applications are, a number of our machines have that capability. If I go to my home button and look for this little t-shirt, that's our sewing applications menu. And it's basically the machine asking us, well, what do you want to do? And I say, oh, well, I want to do a blind hem. So I can just go up here very quickly and hit blind hem, and then here I've got my woven blind hem, or there's my stretch knit blind hem. So that'll get a little stretch for any of my knit fabric. So that's great. So the machine is already set up for my correct stitch width and length, but I can go back to further refine it by hitting this little arrow here. Now, before I do that, though, I will mention, okay, if you don't have this very fancy, gorgeous top-of-the-line machine, that maybe your machine has a stitch that looks like this. It takes a bite into the fabric, and then it goes over here to the right, and there would be, again, 3 or 4 straight stitches. And then there's a bite to the left of that little zigzag. And again, that's where that little blip comes in handy of our foot. That little zigzag goes over that blip. And then again, more straight stitches, then a little bite. So maybe you have a utility stitch that looks like this. Maybe you've got an applique stitch that looks like this on your machine. So any of those stitches as well that you could do for your blind hem. Again, consult your manual and play, just experiment. So I can go into some adjustments here that I can adjust the width of that bite. So if you watch closely, the tip of that bite of that zigzag is going to stay in position, but the rest of this line of stitching is going to go more towards, if this were the raw edge, this line here, if that was the raw edge of my fabric, if I select this, it's going to get, whoops, sorry, this is the other application. Let me retract that. If I hit this, if I hit this button here, then this is what is going to adjust the bite of that zigzag. So there, the tip is staying the same, but I can go here and make that a deeper bite, and then this line of stitching is moving closer to my raw edge. Or I can go back the other way and minimize it and make it really small. I can make that bite really small. So again, if I had that tricot knit fabric, this is where I used that really small bite because I really don't want it to be very big. Again, this is a thinner fabric, a little more delicate. So that's when I would make that bite a little smaller. If I'm using heavier fabric, that's when I would make maybe that bite a little bigger. And again, this is where I could bring my line of stitching closer to the fold and then go back and trim it a little closer as well. So that's when I would adjust that. This is called the baseline. So I would adjust that baseline. No, but I could also go up to this top function here, and that's going to adjust the bite itself. So the bite is going to get bigger. The baseline stays the same, but the bite gets bigger. Or I could go back and turn that to negative, and the bite goes smaller. And the wonderful thing I love about the sophisticated computerized machines is when we start adjusting them and then we want to set it back to default. We don't have to remember any computer settings. We just hit default and it goes right back to where it was. Now, if I hit this little arrow here on my MemoryCraft 15,000, I can go into more settings on the machine. And here, this is my stitch length. So if I'm doing a really heavy fabric, then I want to maybe lengthen this stitch, the distance in between those two zigzag bites. Maybe I want to lengthen it. Or again, if I'm using a more delicate fabric, maybe I want to bring those closer together. This is where, again, stitching your samples really help. You don't want to make them too far apart, though. If I were to increase them, I don't want to make them too far apart, because if this is for a hem, let's say on a pair of pants, I don't want to stick my foot through and potentially, knock out that hem. So they can't be too far apart. But again, you can still do lots of customizing here, even though in the sewing applications, the machine has already set it up for you, that you can always further customize. So for now, I'm just going to put everything back to default and go into, show you over here down at the machine. Now, I find the hardest thing that people have with this is to work your head around how do you position your fabric. So what I always do is, at the iron, I would fold up my fabric the way I always would for my hem. So here's the right side of my fabric. I folded up the hem as indicated on whatever pattern I'm using, however deep I want my hem to be. So I lay my right side down against the fabric. Here is my hem folded back. Then I'm going to pinch right up where my hem edge folds up here. I'm going to pinch that and just tuck it under. So at the bed of my machine, I have the right side of my fabric, and up facing me is, I see, wrong side of my fabric. There's that little edge here, which is the raw edge of my fabric, which again, I could finish with my serger or my pinking blade, whatever. And then I have a fold here, and then that's the fold that we need to concern ourselves with. The more the bite of the needle, then the more the thread is going to show on, the more the thread is going to show on the other side. So in this case, I took a really big bite out of the fold. So then the thread showed more on the right side of the fabric. If I take a really narrow bite out of the fold of the fabric, then that's where I maybe see just a little bit of it, or I don't see it at all. And what makes that achievable and easier is by having that little rudder down through the middle of the foot. So as you line up your hem, you're going to line up the fold of the fabric against that rudder. So when you start doing your rolled hem, the needle is going to start at the left, and it's going to bite into the fold of that fabric to catch the fabric. Then it's going to go back to the right, and it's going to sew down, I think it's about 4 stitches, and then it's going to swing and take another bite into the fold. So this is where you can adjust the length in between those bites, and you can adjust that whole baseline of stitching closer to the raw edge of your fabric, or adjust the baseline closer to the fold of your fabric. And again, adjust the length and width of the bites itself. I know that seems like a lot, but that's where, again, if you read your manual, then you will really understand this. So as I'm going, and then I'm again seeing, okay, maybe I need to ease off a little bit. I need to not push up my fabric too much to that little rudder. I'm just going to kiss it ever so gently. And that is going to produce a smaller bite into the fabric, not as deep. Now, also too, you want to make sure that you use the correct needle for your fabric. For those knits, I would use a smaller, maybe like our size 11 blue tip needle. Has a slight ball point to it, so the size 11 needle would give me a smaller bite into the fabric, as opposed to our Janome purple tip needles, which are size 14, that has the big flared cobra head. That would leave a bigger hole in the fabric, a bigger bite in the fabric. So I hope you can see, maybe I should have used more contrasting thread. So there is the stitches down and then the little bite into my fabric. If I happen to miss maybe, oh, and I missed a couple of these here, I go back just with a hand needle very quickly and do that. If it's one or two, maybe I won't even go back to fix them at all. So very simple and easy. You know, sometimes depending on the garment, I've just put a little bit of fusible web in there too and cheated that way. So if it's just a little bit, it's not the end of the world. But again, just with practice, and there, this actually works out beautifully. I see a tiny little bit of thread there, but if I used thread that matched my fabric, I wouldn't even see that at all. So I would rather see a little bit of thread than none at all, whereas there I missed it. So again, we'd like to avoid that hand stitching where we can. If I had to fix it that way, it's really not that big of a deal, but again, I'd rather see that little bit of thread than have to go thread a hand sewing needle. But in here, that worked out beautifully. So the thicker your fabric, the more your blind hem is going to be disguised. So that works out really good. Now, quickly too, I wanted to show, so that's our blind hem, but there's another great use for this foot. This foot, the blind hem foot, has become my favorite edge stitching foot. So I use this, and here's my beautiful yellow, straight, even line of, it's about 1/8 of an inch away, is typically what edge stitching is from our seam. So this is where my seams are folded to the, folded on top of each other, pressed to one side and stitched down. And here I stitch, my seam is in the middle, and then I pressed my seams flat, open, and then I stitched on either side. So I love it for edge stitching because of that little rudder that's down the middle of the foot. So edge stitching is something we almost always do for garment sewing. Hopefully you can see the contrast. I ended up using red thread on this gorgeous knit, gray knit. But I love edge stitching. And even though this is a knit fabric, I still used my regular G-foot to sew this. Lengthen my stitch slightly, and again I used the Janome blue tip size 11 needle for this knit. But I stitched edge stitch, so my seam where my sleeve meets my garment, that I always edge stitch that so it's nice and flat. And then here where I have two pieces, this lower part of the hoodie and the upper part, I've pressed the seam up, so it's going up, and then I edge stitch that seam so then it's not going to fold down and be messy. I like to edge stitch to keep the seam into position. So on this dress shirt, for example, this is really where I used edge stitching everywhere to keep it nice and clean. It also helps your ironing as well because the seam stays flatter. So here in the shoulder seam, I press the shoulder seam, you know, to the back and then stitch through both layers. Here again, the sleeve seam, pressed it towards the garment, and then I edge stitched. Here along the side seam, I pressed the seams to the back. They're a little less bulky that way, and then I edge stitch down that whole seam so it keeps it nice and flat, and even edge stitch this underarm seam as well. So beautiful even edge stitching, again about maybe 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric, from the seam, or we can move our needle even closer. On this bag here, I did it really close to the edge here. So this is less than 1/8 of an inch away. So whatever you want your edge stitching to be, you can make some adjustments, which I will then show you. And again, the wonderful thing is pretty much any machine would be able to do this. I'm going to come back here to my home screen and go back into utility stitches, just a regular old plain stitching. My needle right now is in center needle position, but in order to make this edge stitching with our G-foot, I'm going to move my needle over to the left more. So it starts at 4.5 as the center needle position for my Memory Craft 15,000 here, but I'm going to move it over to the left to 1.0. So that is my preferred. It's about, again, 1/8 of an inch from the needle to, here's my little sample here, my needle to that groove. So when I finish my seam, and here I just sewed my 1/4 inch seam and I pressed both seam allowances to one side, then I'm going to run the groove, that little rudder of the G-foot down in the ditch of that seam, and my stitching is going to be, again, approximately 1/8 of an inch away. Now, when I'm sewing through, in this case, this denim, normally my average stitch is 2.4. I would probably increase this maybe to about a 3. So for your edge stitching, depending on how many layers you're going through, what thickness is, you might want to lengthen your stitch. But there, that's all beautiful, 1/8 of an inch away. Or in this sample, I sewed my seam and pressed it open. Maybe I want to go even, again, I could go closer, further away. I'll adjust it to 0.5. And again, I'm keeping that little rudder right down the well of my seam. And by moving my needle over, it's only 0.5 away. So I got it a little wider. So long as, and this will work, again, you can adjust it in either direction, but I want to keep my needle on the left side of that little blip. So any of the adjustments from that little blip over to the left, I can use edge stitching with that little rudder in the groove. So does that make sense? It's a really helpful foot. I love using it all the time. So definitely get out your feet and play with it. I love finding new purposes for machine accessories and presser feet, you know, that come with so many machines. They've been around forever, but it's nice to look at them in a new way. So any questions, any concerns? No? Okay.
Well, if you could just quickly mention to Evelyn where that pattern is for the sewing machine cover.
Oh, yes, yes. If you were with us for F, was the border guide foot, the sewing machine cover that I demoed. I don't have it near me to show you, but if you review, go to Janome HQ YouTube channel, and you can see that post of F from the border guide foot. But the sewing machine cover came from Sew for Home. So type in sew, S-E-W, 4, number 4, home.com. Fabulous website. That was a free pattern, and they have a bunch of tutorials on how to make the piping. They use the Janome piping foot, but how to make the piping and how to do all the decorative stitches. So yeah, Sew for Home is a great resource for more information. So yes, and that video again is on Janome HQ, so you can check that out. And then also go to our Janome Life blog. There's a lot of posts written about the border guide foot, so you can find more information there, as well as our G edge stitching foot. I've written a couple of posts using that foot. Now, as I wrap up too, I will see you all on Wednesday, 2 p.m. as always, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Starting next Monday, June 1st, we are going to mix things up a little bit. I'm still going to do Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but instead of 2 p.m., I'm going to go at 1 p.m. And Janome Canada does Instagram Lives. They alternate between Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Tuesday, Thursday. They've been doing 1 p.m., so now we're kind of going to amalgamate to make it a little simpler for all of you to find us. So I'm going to do Janome HQ Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 1 p.m. starting next week, June 1st. And then Janome Canada is going to do Tuesday, Thursday, 1 p.m. So you're going to be able to spend the whole week with the Janome Canada team starting next week, June 1st at 1 p.m. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday will be at Janome HQ at 1 o'clock. And then Tuesday and Thursday will be Janome Canada at 1 o'clock. And then next week, actually, I'm doing some Janome Canada Instagram lives as well. So you'll be seeing a lot of me in the next 2 weeks. But yes, but starting, so that's next week. So then this Wednesday and Friday, I'll still be here, Janome HQ at 2 o'clock. And then stay tuned, Janome America is coming up at 3 o'clock on Facebook. So go to the Janome Sewing Machines page, Facebook, for their Facebook Lives at 3, Monday to Friday. So I will see you all on Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining me. Enjoy your fabulous day. Thank you. Bye.